Hello and welcome to helpyourmath.com. In this video, we are going to talk about the placebo effect and blinding. Clearly, we need to go over some definitions, like what is a placebo, what is the placebo effect, and what are types of blindings. First, a placebo. A placebo lacks the active ingredient or ingredients of the treatment being tested in a study, but looks or feels identical to the treatment so that the participants cannot distinguish whether they are receiving the placebo or the real treatment. So in the case of a drug, you might receive just a sugar pill instead of the actual drug. That would be called receiving the placebo. The placebo effect refers to the situation in which patients improve simply because they believe that they are receiving useful treatment. So when you do an experiment where you have a placebo and you have an experimental group, you might find that both groups improve overall with whatever we're testing. So if you're looking at like a weight loss pill, you might notice that those in the placebo group are also losing weight, and that's because they feel like they're receiving something that's useful, and they might change without even realizing it. They might change what they do every day and make healthier decisions, which causes them to lose weight. Next, we're going to talk about what a blind experiment is. So we can have a single blind experiment. That's if the participants do not know whether they are members of the treatment group or members of the control group, but the experimenters do know. So if I'm handing out the placebo or the drug, I know who's getting which. That would be a single blind if I'm the one who knows. However, in a double blind, neither the participants, nor the experimenter know who belong to which group. So I don't know either. It's all marked, but I don't flip over the sheet of paper that tells me who's in which group. And of course, that would be the gold standard, would be a double blind experiment. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Next, let's talk about case control studies. A case control study is an observational study that resembles an experiment because the sample naturally divides into two or more groups. The participants who engage in the behavior under study form the case, which makes them a treatment group in the experiment. The participants who do not engage in the behavior are the controls, making them like a control group in an experiment. So sometimes we just naturally have this without actually having to put people into group A or group B. Okay, what's wrong with this experiment? For each of the experiments described below, identify any problems and explain how the problems could be avoided. So in our first example, a chiropractor performs adjustments on 25 patients with back pain. Afterward, 18 of the patients say they feel better. He concludes the adjustments are an effective treatment. Yay, chiropractor! Wait, what's wrong with this though? That seems good, right? Well, for one, he only has people in the treatment group. We would need somebody in an experimental group because maybe they just slept on it funny that day and then they felt better because it was a new day. So what we want is we need to make sure we have some sort of placebo in place. Maybe have a fake chiropractor who does a, quote, adjustment that actually doesn't do anything. It doesn't harm them, but it doesn't do anything chiropractor-y either. And then we can compare and see, well, how many of the people from that pretend doctor also reported feeling better. So that would be one thing we might do to improve this study. Okay, how about what's wrong with this experiment? A new drug for a type of attention deficit disorder is supposed to make the affected children less disruptive. Randomly selected children suffering from the disorder are divided into treatment and control groups. Those in the control group receive a placebo that looks just like the real drug. The experiment is single blind. Experimenters interview the children one-on-one and decide whether they became more polite. Now, I don't like saying they became more polite. Anyone suffering from an attention deficit disorder is not necessarily mean or the opposite of polite. So that's just my tangent about this. I apologize. I think they're better able to sit and listen to a lesson or something. I don't know. I think there was a better way of phrasing that. Okay, I'm done with my opinion. Let's move on with what's wrong with this experiment. Well, this was a single blind experiment. So the experimenters who were interviewing these children may treat the children differently because they know who's in the control group and who's in the treatment group. So what would be better is if they would do a double blind. That way they're not, either inadvertently or even advertently conducting interviews differently between the two sets of children. In our next examples, we are going to figure out which type of statistical study is most likely going to lead to an answer and why. Okay, so first, what is the average income of stockbrokers? What's the best way that we could figure this out? Well, we probably just need an observational study. That would be able to tell us what the average income of stockbrokers is, and we would only need to look at stockbrokers. We don't need a control and experiment group, right? We just need to ask the stockbrokers what their incomes are, and they can report to us. Okay, how about this one? Do seatbelts save lives? Now, we can't say, okay, you go in the control group and you go in the experimental group, and let's see what happens. That is dangerous and very, very illegal. So we can't do that, but what we can do is we can look at data that already occurred with crashes, especially fatalities, to see what happens. It would be unethical to do an experiment, so instead we're going to do a observational case control study. We'll look at the research to see who wore seatbelts, those would be the cases, and those who did not wear them, the controls, and we can compare the death rates between the cases and the controls. And, spoiler alert, wearing seatbelts do save lives, so make sure you buckle up. Can lifting weights improve runners' times in a 10-kilometer race? Well, for this one, we would want to do an experiment where we have some runners in an experiment group where they have a weightlifting regimen. So we can look at this here. So they're going to be on a weightlifting program, and a control group where they're going to be asked to not lift weights. You can't give a placebo weight, right? You can't say, okay, here's a 10-pound weight, or is it? Because they're probably going to realize whether it's 10 pounds or not. So we need to make sure that we have one group of runners in a weightlifting program and one who are asked not to lift weights. And otherwise, we must ensure that their training routines are the same. So we want to make sure that these runners are all about, they all run between 8 and, I don't know what kilometers, 4 and 5 minute kilometer, and then we just kind of divide them into two groups based on that. Otherwise, everything else is the same, and then we'll be able to tell whether lifting weights did in fact improve those runners' times or not. And our last example, can a new herbal remedy reduce the severity of colds? In this case, we want to do a double-blind experiment. So this time we can give two groups of people where one group gets a drug and one group gets a control or a placebo. We need the double blind because the severity of the cold may be affected by mood or other factors that might inadvertently influence the experimenter. So we want to make sure the experimenter is not looking for certain things, right? That's called a bias. You want to make sure that they're not like, well, they seem better. So, and I know that they're taking the drug, so clearly the drug is working. Whereas that same person, maybe there's an identical twin who's in the placebo group and they look the same, but you're like, oh, they have a red nose and they coughed once. So I think, it didn't work, and therefore the herbal remedy does in fact work. So we just want to be aware of that. These have been examples of the placebo effect and types of blind experiments. Thank you for stopping by.